The rain came down hard that afternoon, the kind that made the old pavement outside the courthouse look like it was melting into the earth. A slow drizzle of gray light poured over the city as people hurried beneath umbrellas, their eyes avoiding the past that still hung heavy in this town. Inside, in courtroom 4B, silence filled the air like a verdict waiting to be spoken. On the right sat Marjorie, elegant even in grief. Her black dress was simple, the kind that spoke of dignity, not wealth. Her eyes, though deep brown, sharp, unflinching, betrayed a story much older than her 30 years. Across the aisle, Andrew and Clara Whitmore, the late Dr. Samuel Whitmore's biological children, whispered to each other with smirks barely disguised. They didn't try to hide their amusement. To them, the day was a mere formality. After all, how could the adopted girl, the one their father had taken in from a foster home 23 years ago, possibly deserve anything of value from a man like him? When the lawyer cleared his throat and began to read the will, the sound echoed through the chamber like a slow drumbeat. To my daughter Marjorie and Whitmore, the lawyer read, I leave the Whitmore estate, including the family mansion in West Ridge. A low chuckle broke from Andrew's throat, and Clara followed with a laugh she didn't bother to hide. The mansion, she whispered to her brother. That place is nothing but mold and broken windows. Perfect for her. The lawyer continued, along with any assets, holdings, or attached entitlements therein. Andrew rolled his eyes, muttering under his breath, Entitlements. Right. Marjorie didn't move. Her hands rested calmly on her lap, though a storm brewed inside her chest. The house they mocked, the Whitmore mansion, was a decaying shell on a lonely hill 20 miles outside of town, the place where she had once been made to feel both sheltered and unwanted at the same time. It was where she had learned that love could be conditional, that family could have edges sharp enough to cut. She remembered the first day she had arrived there, a trembling 7-year-old with a duffel bag and a thin social worker holding her hand. The mansion had stood tall then, white column cracked from time but still proud, like an old soldier refusing to kneel. Dr. Whitmore had smiled when he saw her, his smile warm and genuine. But behind him, Clara and Andrew had stared at her as if she were a stray animal being brought into their home. Why her dad? Clara had asked that night at dinner. There are so many other kids. Why someone like her? Because she deserves a chance, he'd said simply. And this house needs more love. But love was not something that grew easily in that home. Marjorie had learned to stay quiet, to be invisible. She studied hard, cleaned up after herself, and spoke with a politeness that hid her fear. The years passed, and though her father's affection never faded, the siblings' disdain only deepened. They mocked her hair, her darker skin, and her quiet grace. "You'll never be one of us," Clara would sneer. "Dad's charity project, that's all you are." Still, Marjorie grew. She excelled in school, earned scholarships, and left the mansion at 18 with nothing but her father's pride and a box of old letters he'd given her. She had built her own life, far from the shadows of that crumbling house. She became a woman of education, grace, and quiet strength, qualities that would soon shake the Whitmore's world in ways they couldn't imagine. The lawyer's voice faded as the proceedings ended. Andrew leaned over to Marjorie and smirked. "Guess you're the proud owner of a pile of rubble now. Don't spend it all in one place." Marjorie met his gaze and smiled softly. "I won't," she said. "I'll take care of what's mine." Outside, the rain had slowed to a mist, wrapping the city in silver. Marjorie stood for a moment on the courthouse steps, letting the cool air wash over her. The inheritance wasn't about money, it was about closure, about facing the ghost that still whispered through those cracked walls on West Ridge Hill. That night, she drove alone to the mansion. The road curved through miles of forest, the kind that swallowed sound and memory. When she reached the gates, rusted and heavy with vines, she stopped and stared. The name Whitmore still hung across the arch in iron letters, though the W had fallen long ago. She pushed open the gate and drove up the gravel path. The house appeared through the fog like something from a dream, grand, broken, haunted. Its windows were shattered, ivy was crawling through cracks, and the porch was sagging beneath years of neglect. But still, it stood, and as she stepped out of her car, a strange calm settled over her. The wind whispered through the trees as she walked toward the front door, her heels crunching on wet leaves. She placed her hand on the doorknob, its metal cold against the skin. It turned easily, as though the house had been waiting for her. Inside, dust motes danced in the air like memory itself. The chandelier above the foyer hung crooked, cobwebs draped like faded curtains. She walked slowly through the halls, touching the walls, the banister, and the portraits that still hung in crooked frames, images of a family that never truly included her. And yet, in the study, above the mantel, there was one photograph she had never forgotten, her and her father, taken the year she graduated college. His arm around her shoulders, his eyes proud. "You did what they said you couldn't, Marjorie," he'd told her that day. "You made this name mean something again." She stood before that photograph for a long time. The house creaked around her, the sound of rain against broken glass echoing through empty rooms. She whispered softly, "I'm home, Daddy." The next morning, when Andrew and Clara arrived unannounced, curious, perhaps eager to gloat, they found her standing on the porch, coffee in hand, surveying the land. "Well," Clara began with a smirk, "hope you brought a broom. The place looks like it might collapse." "Don't worry," Marjorie replied calmly. "I have plans for it." "Plans?" Andrew scoffed. "You're not seriously thinking of living here." Marjorie tilted her head slightly. "Maybe not, but it's worth more than you think." They laughed then, loud and careless. "You think that old pile's worth something?" Clara said, "Even the county wouldn't take it." Marjorie only smiled, turning back toward the house. "We'll see." Days turned into weeks. Workers began to appear, surveyors, contractors, historians. Marjorie oversaw everything quietly, rarely explaining her motives. Rumors began to swirl in the small town. People said the mansion had a secret history, that Dr. Whitmore had hidden something there before his death. Others claimed Marjorie was chasing ghosts. But she knew exactly what she was doing. One evening, as she stood in her father's old library with a structural engineer, the man paused near the fireplace. "Ms. Whitmore, have you seen this?" he asked, pointing to a small iron plate embedded in the stone. "Looks like an access panel." Her breath caught. She knelt beside it, brushing away dust until faint engravings became visible, her father's initials, SW. With trembling fingers, she pressed a plate. A soft click echoed through the room, and a hidden compartment slid open. Inside was a single envelope, yellowed with age, and a brass key. On the envelope, in her father's handwriting, were the words, "For Marjorie, when they think you have nothing." Her hand shook as she opened it. Inside was a letter, his final words to her, and a document with legal seals. The letter read, "My dearest daughter, if you're reading this, it means you found your way home. You always will. This house may seem ruined, but what lies beneath it is a foundation of everything I built. Years ago, before I adopted you, I invested in land across this region, land that now sits atop one of the largest oil and mineral deposits discovered in our state. I kept it quiet to protect it from greed. I leave it to you, my rightful heir, because I trust your heart more than their entitlement. Never let them make you feel small. The Whitmore name is yours to define now. Your father, Samuel Whitmore." Marjorie stared at the letter, her eyes filling with tears. Her father had never abandoned her. He had been preparing her. The mansion was not a curse. It was a key. The deeds attached reveal holdings worth over $150 million in today's valuation. She closed her eyes, letting out a deep breath. For the first time, the weight of years lifted from her shoulders. But she said nothing. Not yet. The following week, Clara and Andrew returned again, this time with real estate papers, thinking they could pressure her into selling. "Look," Andrew said, dropping a stack of forms on the porch railing, "you don't have the money to fix this place. Take our offer, $20,000, cash. Be smart." Marjorie smiled faintly. $20,000 for the Whitmore estate. "It's generous," Clara added, crossing her arms. "Honestly, we're doing you a favor." Marjorie looked out over the land, the vast rolling hills stretching beyond the horizon. Her father's land. Her legacy. "I appreciate the offer," she said softly, "but I think I'll hold on to it." "Hold on to what?" Clara scoffed. "A wreck?" "No," Marjorie said, meeting her sister's gaze. A future. And with that, she turned and walked inside, leaving them speechless on the porch. What they didn't know was that beneath the cracked foundation and decaying walls, beneath the laughter and cruelty, there lay something they could never touch, justice wrapped in patience, dignity born of pain. The house that had once been her prison was now her crown. The next morning, sunlight crept across the broken windows of the Whitmore mansion, scattering soft gold across the dusty floorboards. Marjorie stood in the great hall, wrapped in her father's old flannel coat, her mind heavy with the weight of his secret. She had spent the night reading and rereading his letter, every word a thread stitching together years of confusion and silence. The air inside the mansion felt different now, alive. It was as though the house had been waiting all these years for her to find its truth. Down the hall, a team of workers moved carefully, documenting, cleaning, and restoring. What had once been a place of pain was now buzzing with purpose. And at the center of it all stood Marjorie, calm, poised, and unshakable. She knew what the next steps were. Her father's letter had mentioned not only the hidden wealth, but also a series of legal trusts, investments that had matured quietly under her name since she was a child. He had prepared everything, ensuring that when the time came, no one could challenge what was rightfully his. But she also knew the Whitmores, Andrew and Clara, wouldn't accept that easily. 3 days later, she received a call. "Ms. Whitmore." The voice was smooth but firm. It was Attorney Charles Benson, the family lawyer. "I wanted to inform you that your siblings have filed petition to contest a will." Marjorie took a slow breath. "On what grounds?" "They are claiming undue influence," Benson replied. "They say your father wasn't of sound mind when he made the revisions to his will." Marjorie closed her eyes briefly. Of course, they would. "Let them proceed," she said softly. "I have what I need." Her tone surprised him. "You're not worried?" "No," she said, "because my father was many things, Mr. Benson, but confused was never one of them." When the call ended, she stood for a long while by the window, looking out at the sprawling land. The trees swayed under the early autumn wind, their leaves rustling like whispers of support. This fight, she realized, was not just about property or money. It was about respect, about standing firm where she had once been pushed aside. By the time the court date arrived, the story had spread through town. The newspapers loved it. Adopted daughter battles Whitmore heirs over family fortune. Reporters parked near the courthouse, hungry for pictures, quotes, anything that might hint at scandal. Marjorie walked past them without a word, her chin high, her steps measured. She wore a navy blue suit that matched the calmness in her eyes. The whispers followed her like shadows. Inside the courtroom, Clara sat with her lawyer, her face composed but tense. Andrew leaned back, his smirk gone now, replaced by something colder. He had expected her to fold, to be intimidated. But the woman sitting across from him was not the quiet girl who used to eat dinner in silence while he and Clara whispered jokes under their breath. The judge entered, and proceedings began. The Whitmore's attorney wasted no time. "Your Honor," he began, "we contend that Dr. Samuel Whitmore was manipulated by Miss Marjorie Whitmore, who, though adopted, took advantage of his declining health to secure a will in her favor." The words hung in the air, dripping with accusation. Marjorie didn't flinch. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times. When her turn came, she rose slowly, walking to the stand with quiet strength. Her lawyer asked, "Ms. Whitmore, how would you describe your relationship with your father?" Marjorie looked at the judge, her voice steady. "He was the only person who ever made me feel seen," she said. "He taught me that family isn't about blood, it's about who stands beside you when no one else will." The courtroom fell silent. "And did you ever pressure him to change his will?" A small, sad smile touched her lips. "I didn't even know he had." Her attorney nodded. "Your father also established several trusts in your name when you were a child, correct?" "Yes," she replied, "but I didn't discover them until after his passing." At that, her lawyer produced a sealed letter, the one from the hidden compartment. The courtroom gasped softly as the judge examined it, reading Dr. Whitmore's handwriting. The authenticity was undeniable. Every line spoke not of manipulation, but of deliberate love and foresight. By the time the hearing ended, Andrew and Clara's lawyer had begun to crumble under the weight of evidence. Their claim dissolved in the face of their father's words. The judge leaned back and spoke calmly. It's clear Dr. Whitmore's intent was purposeful. The will stands as written. Marjorie closed her eyes for a moment, letting out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Justice, she thought, had a quiet sound. It didn't shout, it breathed. Across the aisle, Clara looked stunned. Andrew's jaw tightened, his pride refusing to let him bow, but the fight in his eyes was dimming. Still, Marjorie didn't gloat. She simply turned to them and said, "This was never about taking from you. It was about honoring the man who gave to me." Then she left the courtroom. Outside, reporters swarmed her with questions. "Ms. Whitmore, how does it feel to win? What will you do with the mansion? Is it true there's more to the inheritance?" She paused only once, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not interested in revenge," she said. "I'm interested in rebuilding what was broken. Some inheritances aren't about money, they're about healing." The next day, her words were everywhere. Weeks passed. The restoration of the Whitmore mansion became a project of hope. Local builders volunteered, inspired by her story. Donations flowed in, not because people pitied her, but because they respected her resolve. The mansion's rebirth became symbolic, a story whispered in churches, community centers, and small-town cafes, the black woman who turned pain into legacy. One afternoon, as she oversaw the restoration of the study, she found herself standing before her father's photograph again. The workers' laughter echoed faintly in the hall, but she felt alone in that moment, connected to something deeper. She whispered softly, "You kept your promise. Daddy, you gave me a chance." Behind her, the contractor cleared his throat. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, "you might want to see this." He led her outside, to the edge of the estate where the land dipped toward the forest. There, surveyors had begun to clear ground for new foundation work. The soil, freshly toned, revealed something unexpected. Pipes, heavy machinery, and faint metallic glints beneath the earth. One of the workers pointed. "We ran a geological scan. There's a whole system down there, old exploratory wells. Looks like your father wasn't lying. There's oil, and a lot of it." Marjorie's breath caught. The words from her father's letter came rushing back. "What lies beneath this house is a foundation of everything I built." The contractor continued, "If you develop this land carefully, you could be sitting on." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Hundreds of millions." She smiled faintly. "I know." That night, she sat on the mansion's porch, alone beneath a sky streaked with stars. The air was warm and gentle, carrying the faint scent of pine and rain. She thought of her childhood, of loneliness, laughter that wasn't haze, and hands that never reached out when she cried. But also of the moments of kindness her father had given her, his stories, his lessons, his belief that strength could come from gentleness. She whispered into the night, "You knew they'd laugh. You knew they'd never understand." And she was right. For even now, miles away, Andrew and Clara were sitting in a dimly lit bar, nursing their anger. "She played us," Andrew muttered, slamming his glass down. "All this time, she knew." "Knew what?" Clara snapped. "That Dad left her the scraps." He looked at her, eyes dark. "Scraps worth millions." Clara froze. "What are you talking about?" He pulled out his phone, showing her the latest news article. Whitmore Estate confirmed to sit on $150 million in oil and mineral reserves. The color drained from her face. "No, that can't be right." "Oh, it's right," Andrew said bitterly. "The mansion we marked, the land we laugh about, that's the gold mine." They sat in silence, the weight of their arrogance settling in. For years, they had looked down on her and ridiculed her existence. Now, the sister they had dismissed had become the rightful heir not only of their father's fortune, but also of his legacy. Days turned into months, and the mansion began to transform. The white columns were rebuilt, the gardens replanted, and the windows restored to their former brilliance. But Marjorie didn't rebuild it as a monument to wealth. She rebuilt it as a symbol of dignity. She opened its doors to children from foster homes, giving them tutoring, shelter, and mentorship. The Whitmore Foundation for Opportunity was born not from charity, but from memory. One of the first children to arrive, a shy 12-year-old named Kayla, reminded her of herself at that age, timid, unsure, carrying the weight of other people's rejection. Marjorie knelt beside her on the first day and said gently, "You don't have to be like anyone else here. Just be yourself. That's enough." Kayla looked up, eyes wide. "Are you the lady who owns this big house?" Marjorie smiled. "Yes, I am. But more than that, I'm someone who once needed a home, too." The girl smiled shyly, and something inside Marjorie healed in that moment, a piece of her childhood finding rest. Meanwhile, Andrew and Clara's life began to unravel. Their attempt to challenge the will had drained their savings. Their social circles, once filled with privilege, had grown quiet. People whispered now, not in admiration, but in judgment. The arrogance that had once shielded them became their undoing. Clara sent a letter one day. A single page. No apology, just confusion. "I don't understand how you could forgive him for choosing you over us. You weren't even really family." Marjorie read the words and sighed. She didn't respond. Some wounds, she realized, aren't hers to heal. But one evening, as she stood watching the sunset from the porch, she whispered softly to herself, "I forgive you anyway." Because forgiveness, she knew, wasn't about them. It was about setting herself free. The mansion glowed that evening, light spilling from every window, laughter from the children echoing through the halls. It no longer felt haunted. It felt alive, reborn. Marjorie stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the people below, children, teachers, and volunteers. She thought of her father again, of the man who had seen beyond her skin, her past, and her fear. "You gave me more than a house," she murmured. "You gave me a reason to keep standing." And as she looked out into the night, she knew that the story of the Whitmore mansion was no longer one of arrogance or tragedy. It had become something far greater, a testament to resilience, to the power of love, and to the quiet strength of a black woman who refused to be defined by anyone else's laughter. Months passed, and the Whitmore mansion stood once again in its full glory. Where once ivy and decay had ruled, now gleamed polished marble floors, golden chandeliers, and walls adorned with portraits that told not just one family's story, but an entire generation's triumph. The house had been reborn not as a fortress of pride, but as a beacon of purpose. Every day, vans arrived at the gates carrying children from foster homes and underprivileged neighborhoods. They came timid, uncertain, often carrying invisible scars. But within weeks, the place filled with laughter, the kind that came from healing, not arrogance. Marjorie had turned what was once a symbol of exclusion into a sanctuary of inclusion. And the irony was not lost on her. She had been the one they mocked for being an outsider, yet she was the only one who had made this house truly belong to everyone. One afternoon, as she met with her foundation team in the old dining hall, her assistant Devin, a soft-spoken man with sharp eyes and a background in community law, entered the room looking uneasy. "Ms. Whitmore," he began carefully, "you might want to see this." He handed her a folded newspaper. The headline made her chest tighten. Whitmore's siblings announce legal counterclaim, demand share of family trusts. Marjorie sighed, setting the paper down. "So it begins again." Devin frowned. "They are claiming they have rights to the mineral wealth under the estate. They are saying it wasn't part of the will." She looked out the window for a long time before speaking. "Greed is an old disease," she said quietly. "An entitlement, that's just a shadow." That evening, she sat in her father's old library, the letter he'd left her still framed on the desk. His words stared back at her. "Never let them make you feel small." But even as she whispered those words to herself, she knew this new battle would be different. It wasn't about the house anymore. It was about who would define the Whitmore legacy, the old arrogance of bloodline or the quiet dignity of earned worth. She called her legal team the next morning. "Prepare everything," she said. "We'll fight this properly. But this time, I want transparency. Let the world see who they are and what they're fighting for." The new case drew national attention. News channels, blogs, and social media were ablaze with debate. Some headlines read, "Adopted Black Daughter versus Privileged Heirs. Who owns a Whitmore legacy?" From mansion to movement, how Marjorie Whitmore redefined family wealth. Talk shows discuss her story. Community leaders praise her integrity. But not everyone celebrated. The Whitmore siblings, backed into a corner, began launching public attacks, interviews filled with bitterness and revisionist memory. Clara's voice echoed on one broadcast. My father was manipulated. He didn't understand what he was signing. She was never part of our family. She doesn't deserve to use our name. Marjorie watched the clip in silence. Devin, beside her, looked furious. Do you want me to issue a public response? He asked. She shook her head. No, let them speak. The truth doesn't need to shout. The court hearings resumed, but this time Marjorie wasn't the quiet figure she once was. She stood before cameras, not as a victim but as a woman who owned her story. During one session, Andrew's lawyer tried to undermine her again. Ms. Whitmore, he said sharply, you're aware that your father's estate, including these lands, was built long before you were adopted. Why do you believe you deserve it? She turned toward him slowly. Her voice was calm, her words deliberate. Because my father believed legacy isn't inherited, it's owned. And because I'm the only one doing something worthy with it. The courtroom murmured. The lawyer hesitated, then sat down, defeated by her grace. Outside, crowds had gathered, supporters, students, single mothers, pastors, and old neighbors. They held signs that read justice for Marjorie and legacy over blood. For many, her story had become more than a family feud. It had become a mirror reflecting their own battles against prejudice, classism, and entitlement. After the hearing, a reporter asked, Ms. Whitmore, what do you want from all this? She paused before replying. I want them to understand that family isn't something you're born into. It's something you honor. My father didn't adopt me to divide his children. He did it to show what love could build when the world teaches you to hate. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady. Cameras flashed. The clip went viral overnight. Within days, the world knew not just her story but also her message. Meanwhile, Andrew and Clara's world was collapsing. Their lawyers, overwhelmed by public backlash and the undeniable paper trail of their father's intentions, began to withdraw from the case. Late one night, Andrew drove up to the mansion alone. Rain poured as it had on the day of the first will reading. He parked at the gates, headlights slicing through the mist, and sat there for a long time, watching the house glow warmly in the distance. It no longer felt like his. Finally, he stepped out and walked to the porch, soaked, trembling, and with pride cracked open. Marjorie was standing there, as if she'd been waiting. You shouldn't be here, she said quietly. I needed to see it, he replied, to see what you turned it into. She studied his face. The arrogance was gone. What remained was exhaustion and regret. Dad always said you were strong, he murmured. I thought he was just blinded. He wasn't, she said simply. He saw what you refused to. He nodded, looking down. We lost everything. Marjorie. The house, the land, even the name. People don't respect us anymore. You didn't lose it, she corrected softly. You gave it away every time you laughed at someone you thought was beneath you. He winced but didn't argue. Then, after a long silence, he whispered, Do you hate us? She thought about it, about the years of pain, the whispers, the humiliation, about the night she cried alone in her tiny foster bed, believing love had conditions. Then she said, No, I just finally stopped needing you to love me. He looked at her for a moment, as though trying to understand what strength like that felt like. Then he turned and walked away into the rain. A week later, the court dismissed their claims entirely. The judge's words were brief but final. The Whitmore estate and all attached holdings are legally, morally, and rightfully under the sole ownership of Ms. Marjorie and Whitmore. Applause broke out in the courtroom, not from arrogance, but from relief, respect, and vindication. Marjorie didn't smile. She only bowed her head, whispering a silent thank you to the man who had believed in her when no one else did. When she returned home that evening, the children were waiting. They ran to her as she stepped out of the car, cheering and hugging her. Miss Marjorie, you won. You really won. She laughed softly, bending down to hug them back. No, she said gently, we won. Inside, the staff had prepared a small celebration. Nothing extravagant, just warmth and community. Music filled the halls once again. Not classical symphonies like in the old days, but gospel, soul, and laughter. The mansion was alive with rhythm, black joy breathing through its walls. In the corner, Devin raised a glass. "To second chances," he said. Marjorie lifted hers. "And to knowing your worth." They clinked glasses, the sound like a promise echoing in the air. Later that night, she walked alone through the upper corridor, stopping at her father's portrait. He looked as he always had, wise, calm, proud. "It's done, Daddy," she whispered. "They tried to take it, but your lesson stayed stronger than their greed." As she turned to leave, a gust of wind rattled the window slightly, and for a moment she swore she could hear his voice in the stillness. "I always knew you'd stand taller than this house." Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't of sadness. They were of peace. In the months that followed, the Whitmore Foundation expanded across the state. Marjorie used the mineral revenue not to flaunt wealth but to fund scholarships, build art programs, and create career training centers for foster youth aging out of the system. She insisted every project bear not her name but her father's inscription. "Love build where arrogance destroys." The mansion became more than a story. It became a movement, a living monument to transformation. Documentaries were made. University professors invited her to speak about legacy, race, and resilience. Her quiet strength inspired thousands, especially young black women who saw in her reflection of their own unspoken struggles to be seen, respected, and unashamed of their worth. But not every part of the story was public. Sometimes, late at night, Marjorie would still think of Clara. The letter she'd received months ago remained tucked in a drawer, unanswered. A small part of her hoped one day Clara might come to her door, not with bitterness, but with understanding. Because deep down, despite everything, Marjorie believed in redemption. She had lived it. Until that day, she would continue doing what her father had taught her, to love without losing dignity, to forgive without forgetting the lesson, and to build even when others tried to break. That autumn, the mansion's grand reopening ceremony drew hundreds. As the choir sang under the soft glow of lanterns, Marjorie stood on the balcony overlooking the crowd. The same balcony where she had once stood as a child, watching the world from behind glass, feeling small and invisible. Now, faces looked up at her with admiration, with gratitude. She wasn't the outcast anymore. She was the heart of it all. She spoke softly into the microphone, her voice carried by the wind. There was a time when this house was filled with laughter that hurt and silence that screamed. But today, it stands for something different. It stands for grace, for what it means to rise above what tried to bury you. My father once told me, "You'll know who you are when you stop needing them to tell you." And today, I know who I am. The crowd erupted into applause. Children waved banners, elders nodded through tears, and somewhere in the back, even Andrew watched quietly, hands in his pockets, eyes heavy with something close to remorse. The mansion's lights glowed brighter that night than they had in decades, as if every beam of light carried her father's blessing, every stone whispering, "You did it, my daughter. You brought it home." Winter crept gently across West Ridge Hill. Frost edged the window panes of the newly restored Whitmore mansion, and the gardens, once overrun with weeds, now shimmered under a thin blanket of silver. Inside, the fireplaces burnt bright, their warmth spilling into every corridor. Children's laughter floated up the stairwells, echoing like music that healed old wounds. Marjorie stood by the tall bay window in the study, a cup of tea in her hand, watching the first flakes fall. Her reflection merged with the glass, strong, graceful, unflinching. So much had changed in just a year, yet the ache in her chest never fully faded. Success hadn't erased the memories. It had simply taught her how to breathe through them. Devin entered quietly, holding a stack of envelopes. "Morning mail," he said, "mostly invitations and donations. But this one." He held up a plain white envelope. Came with no return address. Marjorie took it, recognizing the familiar slant of the handwriting before she even opened it. "Clara." She hesitated, then unfolded the paper. "Marjorie, I've watched everything you built. I won't pretend to understand how you kept standing after everything was said and did. I don't expect forgiveness. But I would like to see the house one last time. Not the way we left it, but the way you made it. If you'll have me. Clara. Marjorie stared at the words, her heart caught between old pain and new compassion. For years she had imagined what an apology might sound like. Now, seeing it written out, it felt both heavy and light at once. She looked up at Devin. "Tell her to come," she said softly. "No cameras. No press. Just her." 3 days later, the mansion gates opened to a sleek black car. Marjorie waited on the porch, wrapped in a wool coat, snowflakes gathering in her curls. When the car door opened, Clara stepped out slowly. She looked smaller than Marjorie remembered, her once impeccable posture bent, her confidence dimmed. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Only the wind whispered through the pines. Finally, Clara managed, "You look like him when you stand there." Marjorie smiled faintly. "I used to think that was a curse. Now I know it's a blessing." They entered the mansion together. The warmth met them instantly, along with a hum of children studying in the library and a piano playing faintly somewhere down the hall. Clara turned slowly, eyes wide. "It's alive," she whispered. "I don't remember it ever feeling alive." "It didn't," Marjorie replied. "Not until it stopped belonging to Faye." They walked through the corridors in silence. In every room, there was life, artwork from the children, books stacked neatly, and the smell of cocoa drifting from the kitchen. Clara paused in front of their father's portrait. "I used to think he was cool," she said quietly. "Choosing you, leaving us out." Marjorie's tone was gentle but firm. "He didn't choose me over you. He chose me over you. You just never accepted it." Clara swallowed hard. "We were raised to believe love was a competition. We didn't know how to share." Marjorie nodded slowly. "Neither did I. I just learnt later that love multiplies when you give it away." A tear slid down Clara's cheek. "I'm sorry." The words hung in the air, trembling. Marjorie didn't rush to fill the silence. She let them settle, old echoes finally finding peace. Then she said simply, "Thank you." They sat in the library for hours, talking, not about money or lawsuits, but about childhood. The memories came in fragments. The sound of their father's laughter, the way he used to hum while writing at his desk, the smell of pine polish in the halls. It was as if the years of bitterness had burnt away, leaving only what mattered. Before leaving, Clara asked, "What will happen to all this when you're gone?" Marjorie smiled, looking around the room. "It'll belong to them," she said, nodding toward the children playing outside. "Every generation deserves a house that believes in them." As Clara turned to go, she stopped at the doorway. "For what it's worth," she said softly, "Dad was right about you." Marjorie met her eyes. "He was right about you, too. You just had to find it." Clara left with tears in her eyes. For the first time, Marjorie felt the weight of the past loosen its grip. That night, she walked the halls alone, remembering everything. The cruelty, the loneliness, the courage it took to stay kind. She passed the old mirror in the foyer and paused. The reflection that stared back was not the frightened girl who once felt invisible. It was a woman her father had always seen. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The mansion glowed like a lighthouse on the hill. In the following months, news of Marjorie's work spread beyond state lines. The Whitmore Foundation grew into a national initiative. New centers opened in Detroit, Atlanta, and New Orleans. She traveled often, not to chase fame but to plant roots in forgotten places, neighborhoods where dreams had been strangled by poverty and prejudice. Everywhere she went, people recognized her not as the adopted daughter, but as Ms. Whitmore, the woman who rebuilt her father's dream. During one speech at Howard University, a young student asked, "How did you stay strong when they laughed at you?" Marjorie smiled gently. "Because I learned that laughter from arrogance is just fear wearing perfume. When people mock you, it's usually because they are terrified of what your strength says about their weakness." The auditorium erupted in applause. Cameras flashed, but her gaze stayed humble. For her, strength was never loud. It was steady. A year later, the mansion celebrated its 10,000th child to enter the program. The celebration drew families, alumni, donors, even a few familiar faces from the old town. Among them stood Andrew Whitmore. He approached quietly as the crowd dispersed. He looked older, his hair thinner, his eyes weary but sincere. He extended his hand. "Marjorie," He said, voice low, I heard about what you've done. I didn't think I had the right to come, but I needed to see it for myself. She shook his hand, surprised by the warmth in his grip. You always had the right, she said kindly. You just never used it. He gave a small, broken laugh. You turned everything we mocked into something beautiful. That's what faith does, she said. It turns rubble into ruins. Andrew's eyes glistened. I'm sorry, he murmured, for all of it. She placed a hand over his. Then start by forgiving yourself. That evening, after the guests left, Marjorie sat in the empty dining hall where everything had begun, the same room where a frightened little girl once stared at fine china she was too afraid to touch. Now, the table was filled with hand-drawn cards from children, photographs of graduates, and letters of gratitude. She opened one letter, written by a 16-year-old named Elijah, a former foster youth. Ms. Whitmore, when I came here, I didn't believe I'd ever be anything. Now I want to be an architect so I can build houses where kids like me feel safe. You taught me that being loved doesn't mean being lucky. It means being worthy. Thank you for showing me what home feels like. Elijah. Tears blurred the words. She pressed the letter to her heart. In that moment, she understood her father's vision completely. The mansion had never been meant as a monument to wealth. It was a vessel for purpose. He had trusted her to fill it with life, and she had. Years rolled by. Seasons came and went. The mansion became an enduring symbol of transformation. Tourists visited, journalists wrote books, but for Marjorie, fame was irrelevant. Her joy came each time a young graduate returned to say, I made it. When she turned 60, a grand ceremony was held to honor her lifetime of service. People from across the nation gathered in the courtyard, the same courtyard where once weeds had grown through cracked stone. Now it bloomed with lilies and light. Devin, gray-haired now, stood beside her. You know, he said with a smile, I think Dr. Whitmore would have been proud. Marjorie laughed softly. I think he already knows. As the choir began to sing, she looked toward the horizon, where the sun dipped low over the hills. And for the first time, she allowed herself to rest, not from exhaustion, but from fulfillment. Later that night, long after the celebration ended, she walked alone through the mansion. Her footsteps echoed softly, mingling with the faint laughter of children asleep upstairs. She entered the study and stood before her father's portrait. You were right, Daddy, she whispered. They thought I had nothing, but you knew I had everything that mattered. She touched the frame gently, then turned off the light. The glow of the fireplace flickered across the walls, casting golden shadows that seemed to dance in approval. In the years that followed, the Whitmore Foundation continued to thrive even after Marjorie stepped down. Her legacy lived in every scholarship granted, every child housed, and every soul that learned to believe again. Clara and Andrew both became quiet benefactors, funding programs in their own cities. Pride had melted into gratitude. The Whitmore name, once divided by prejudice, now stood united by purpose. And at the top of the hill, the mansion remained, strong, shining, timeless. When Marjorie Whitmore passed away peacefully one spring morning, the news spread across the nation. People gathered outside the mansion with candles and flowers. The gates overflowed with notes from former students. You gave me a home. You taught me to forgive. You made me believe in me. During her memorial, Clara spoke through tears. She was more of a sister than I ever deserved. She didn't just inherit a house. She inherited grace, and she shared it with the world. Andrew added quietly, For years, we thought she was beneath us. Turns out, we were standing beneath her. The choir sang softly as the sun broke through the clouds, flooding the grounds with light. And for a moment, every heart there understood the meaning of legacy, not what you leave behind, but who you lift as you go. Long after the ceremony ended, a little girl wandered the halls of the mansion. She stopped in front of the framed letter on the wall, the one that had started it all. She traced the word with her tiny finger and smiled. One day, she whispered, I'll do something good too. And outside, the wind carried her voice across the hill, mingling it with the whispers of the pines, the laughter of generations, and the unshakable echo of a father's belief in his daughter. Epilogue. Years later, Scholars would write about Marjorie Whitmore as a symbol of modern resilience, a black woman who turned the remnants of prejudice into an empire of compassion. Her story would be taught in classrooms, her foundation would educate thousands more, and the Whitmore Mansion would remain open, not as a museum, but as a living promise. For those who visited, the message etched in stone at the gate said it all. Where arrogance once stood, dignity now lives.